A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
If you look at a radar sweep of the Persian Gulf right now, specifically from the perspective of the United States Central Command, you are looking at one of the most dense and sophisticated sensor networks ever assembled. It is a digital tripwire that stretches from the borders of Turkey down to the Horn of Africa. And it is the only reason the current regional tensions haven't spiraled even further out of control. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the history and strategic rationale behind these United States military bases in the Middle East, specifically the ones outside of Israel. He wants us to look at their role as forward depots and radar centers, and how they have been quietly preparing for the specific conflict dynamics we are seeing with Iran here in March of 2026.
It is a timely prompt because people often see these bases as just leftovers from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or as static symbols of American presence. But the reality is that the architecture has fundamentally shifted over the last 5 to 7 years. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been obsessed with the logistics of theater-level deterrence for a long time. What we are looking at today is not the sprawling, city-sized footprint of the 2000s. It is a highly integrated, software-defined network designed to solve one specific problem, the tyranny of distance.
The tyranny of distance is a great way to put it. When people look at a map, they see the United States as this distant power trying to project force across an ocean. But these bases essentially move the American border to the edge of the Iranian plateau. We are currently sitting in a high-alert environment following those regional flare-ups in February, and I think we should start by clarifying what these places actually are today. We are not talking about massive infantry hubs anymore, are we?
Not at all. The shift has been from counterinsurgency infrastructure to what we call high-end anti-access and area denial monitoring. If you go back to episode 830, we talked about the global footprint and how base sovereignty works, but the Middle Eastern theater has its own unique flavor. These bases are now primarily forward depots and sensor nodes. A forward depot is essentially a massive, climate-controlled warehouse filled with what we call warm material. It is not just sitting there gathering dust, it is maintained in a state of near readiness so that if a conflict breaks out, the United States doesn't have to wait 3 weeks for a ship to cross the Atlantic. The munitions, the spare parts for fighter jets, and the fuel are already there.
So it is less about the 35,000 personnel currently stationed in the region and more about the stuff those personnel can turn on at a moment's notice. It is a move from presence to resilience. But I want to dig into the radar aspect, because that seems to be the real teeth of the deterrent right now. When Daniel mentions radar centers, he's talking about more than just some guys in a tower watching for planes.
He is talking about the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Network, or IAMD. This is the crown jewel of the United States posture in the Gulf. The center of this is the ANTPY-2 radar. This is a transportable X-band radar that is part of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD. We have these units positioned strategically in places like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. These radars have an effective range of over 1,000 kilometers. To put that in perspective, a radar sitting at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar can look deep into Iranian territory. It can see a ballistic missile the moment it leaves the launch pad, long before it clears the atmosphere.
And that is the key difference between 2026 and, say, 2010. Back then, we were reacting to launches. Now, the sensor fusion is so tight that the United States and its partners in the Gulf are basically watching the launch sequence in real time. But how does that actually translate to deterrence? If Iran knows we can see them, does that actually stop them? Or does it just change how they attack?
It changes the calculus of success. Deterrence in this theater is about making the cost of an attack higher than the potential benefit. If Iran knows that their primary ballistic missile threat is going to be intercepted by a layered defense of Patriots and THAAD batteries, because we have a persistent radar lock from the second of ignition, the utility of those missiles drops. But what is fascinating is how this data is shared. It is not just an American bubble. This radar data is fed into a common operational picture that includes our partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council. It creates a collective shield.
I remember we touched on this in episode 5081 when we talked about the THAAD shield. The technical architecture is one thing, but the logistics of keeping those sites active is where the forward depot model comes in. You mentioned warm supply chains. How does the United States maintain those without becoming a target themselves? If I am an Iranian planner, those warehouses are the first thing I want to hit.
That is where the hardening comes in. Since the regional flare-ups in February, we have seen a massive push to harden these facilities. We are talking about reinforced hangars, underground fuel storage, and distributed logistics. Instead of having one giant pile of supplies at Al Udeid, the United States has moved toward a lily pad model. They use smaller, more agile sites that can be activated quickly. This is supported by what we call pre-positioned war reserve stocks, or WRSAI. These are essentially pre-packaged combat sets. If a squadron of F-35s needs to deploy to the region from the United States, they don't bring their own maintenance gear. They land, they plug into the pre-positioned stock, and they are mission ready in hours instead of days.
It is like a plug-and-play military. You bring the talent and the airframes, and the infrastructure is already waiting for you. You mentioned Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which is often called the central nervous system of the region. It hosts the Combined Air Operations Center. I think it is worth explaining why that specific base is so critical to the current preparation for a conflict with Iran. It seems like the one place where everything converges.
Al Udeid is indispensable because it is the hub for command and control. Every single flight, every drone mission, and every radar track in the entire Central Command area of responsibility is managed from there. It is the brain. But more importantly, it is the primary node for the air bridge. We discussed the logistics of the air bridge in episode 1005, and it is the only thing that makes this forward depot model sustainable. Because the United States doesn't want to rely on vulnerable ground transport through crowded shipping lanes or hostile territory, they use a constant stream of C-17 and C-5 transport planes. These planes move high-value assets between the hubs like Al Udeid and the spokes, which are the smaller tactical sites.
But there is a political tension here that I think we need to address. These host nations, like Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, have a very complicated relationship with Iran. They are neighbors, they have trade ties. They aren't always thrilled about the idea of their soil being used for offensive operations against Tehran. How does the United States manage that sovereignty paradox while still maintaining a credible deterrent?
It is a constant diplomatic tightrope. Most of the agreements the United States has with these countries are specifically for defensive purposes. This is why the radar and missile defense focus is so brilliant from a strategic perspective. It is hard for a host nation to object to a radar that protects their own cities from incoming missiles. But when it comes to offensive strikes, the restrictions are much tighter. In the current 2026 environment, we have seen host nations explicitly tell the United States that they cannot launch certain types of kinetic missions from their territory. This is why the United States has invested so much in long-range standoff capabilities and sea-based assets. The bases provide the eyes and the supplies, but the actual punch might come from outside the host nation's borders to respect that sovereignty.
So, the bases are the shield and the warehouse, but not necessarily the sword. That makes a lot of sense. It allows the Gulf states to maintain a level of plausible deniability, while still benefiting from the American security umbrella. But let's look at the Iranian perspective for a second. If you are sitting in Tehran, you see these ANTPY-2 radars looking into your backyard every single day. You see the C-17s landing every hour with fresh munitions. How is Iran adapted to this specific hub-and-spoke architecture?
They have gone all in on asymmetric saturation. If you can't beat the radar, you try to overwhelm it. This is why we see such a heavy emphasis on drone swarms and low-flying cruise missiles. A ballistic missile has a very predictable arc that a THAAD radar can track easily. A low-flying drone that follows the terrain and mimics the radar cross-section of a bird is a much harder problem. Iran's strategy is to find the gaps in the sensor net. They know where the radars are located. They know the refresh rates. So they invest in thousands of cheap, expendable systems designed to soak up the expensive interceptors kept in those forward depots.
It is a cost imposition strategy. If it costs the United States $2 million to fire an interceptor at a drone that costs $20,000 to build, the math eventually fails the defender. That is where the sensor-to-shooter loop becomes so important. You have to be able to identify the threat and decide the most efficient way to kill it almost instantly.
And that loop is getting tighter. We are seeing the integration of artificial intelligence into these radar networks to help distinguish between a decoy and a real threat. But the real shift in 2026 has been the move toward directed energy and electronic warfare at these forward bases. The United States is starting to deploy high-power microwaves and lasers at these sites because you can't run out of bullets if your bullet is a beam of light. It solves the depot replenishment problem. If you can neutralize a drone swarm with electricity, you don't have to wait for the next C-17 to bring you more missiles.
That is a massive technological leap. It turns the base from a passive target into an active, almost self-sustaining fortress. I want to go back to the history for a moment. You mentioned that these bases weren't always designed for this. A lot of people forget that places like Al-Assad in Iraq or the bases in Kuwait were built for very different reasons. How much of the current preparation for Iran was intentional versus just a lucky byproduct of existing infrastructure?
A lot of it was a very deliberate pivot that started around 2018 and 2019. Before that, the focus was almost entirely on counter-terrorism. We were looking for small groups of people in trucks. But after the 2020 missile attack on Al-Assad Air Base, the military had a massive wake-up call. That attack showed that Iran had the capability to hit American facilities with high precision. That was the moment the transition to the current high-alert posture really accelerated. The military realized that the old way of doing business, where you just have a few thousand troops in a relatively soft camp, was over. They began the process of what they call theater hardening. They started burying the command centers, diversifying the radar locations, and most importantly, integrating the regional partners into a single defensive grid.
It is interesting because it mirrors the broader strategic shift we have seen in American foreign policy. We are moving away from these forever wars and toward peer or near-peer competition. Iran, while not a global peer like China, is certainly a regional peer in terms of missile technology. So the bases have become a laboratory for how the United States intends to fight in the future. It is a software-defined battlefield.
It really is. And the data we are getting from these radar centers is invaluable. Every time Iran tests a missile or launches a drone, those ANT-PY2 radars are recording every byte of data. They are learning the signatures, the flight patterns, and the vulnerabilities. It is a constant game of cat and mouse. What I find wild is the level of automation involved. In many cases, the decision to pass a radar track from a site in Qatar to a battery in the United Arab Emirates happens in milliseconds without a human having to manually click a button. That is the only way to handle the speeds we are talking about with modern missile tech.
This brings up the sustainability question. We are currently in March of 2026, and the Middle East has been on high alert for months. We have seen the regional flare-ups. We have seen the mobilization. Can the United States maintain this level of intensity? You have 35,000 people on high alert, you have a constant air bridge, and you have these expensive radar systems running 24/7. At what point does the cost of the deterrent become too high, especially as we try to pivot toward the Indo-Pacific?
That is the big debate in the Pentagon right now. The goal is to make this posture as automated and low footprint as possible. This is why the forward depot model is so important. If you can get the infrastructure to a point where it only requires a skeleton crew to maintain the warm stocks and the sensors, you can surge personnel in only when the intelligence suggests an imminent threat. We are moving toward a dynamic force employment model. Instead of having a carrier strike group sitting in the Gulf for 6 months, you might have it nearby in the Indian Ocean, ready to move in, while the land-based sensors and depots provide the persistent backbone.
It is basically a just-in-time delivery model for military force, but that only works if your intelligence is perfect. If you misread the signs and you don't have the personnel on the ground to activate those depots, the whole system collapses. It seems like a high-stakes gamble on technology over sheer numbers.
It is a gamble, but it is one the United States feels it has to take. The old model of keeping 100,000 troops in the region is politically and economically impossible now. The current posture is designed to blunt an initial strike. That is a specific military term. The goal isn't necessarily to stop every single missile, but to absorb the blow, protect the most critical assets, and then provide the logistical springboard for a massive counterattack. The depots are the insurance policy for that counterattack.
I think a lot of people miss that distinction. They think the bases are there to win the war on day one, but they are really there to make sure the United States doesn't lose the war on day one. It is about survival and then escalation. Looking at the current state of things, how do you see this evolving over the next year? If we are still in this high-tension state with Iran a year from now, does the architecture change again?
I think we will see even more decentralization. The United States is looking at sites in places like Oman and even further west into Saudi Arabia to get out of the immediate range of Iran's shorter-range systems. They want to create more depth in the defense. You will also see more investment in mobile radar units. Fixed sites are easy to target with ballistic missiles because the coordinates never change. But if you have high-end radars that can pack up and move every 48 hours, you make the enemy's targeting problem infinitely harder.
It is a return to the mobile warfare concepts of the Cold War, but with 21st century sensors. I want to talk about the second-order effects of this basing. We have talked about the military side, but what does this do to the regional power balance? When the United States builds a massive radar hub in a place like Qatar, it effectively ties Qatar's security to the United States in a way that is very hard to undo. Does this create a situation where these host nations are essentially trapped in the American orbit, whether they like it or not?
To an extent, yes. It is what we call the sovereignty paradox. By hosting these facilities, they gain a massive security guarantee, but they lose a significant amount of freedom in their own foreign policy. They can't easily pivot to a neutral stance if they are hosting the literal nervous system of the American military presence. But for most of these countries, the threat from Iran is perceived as so existential that they are willing to make that trade. They see the integrated air defense as their best hope of surviving a regional conflagration.
And from the American perspective, it is a way to ensure that these partners stay aligned with United States interests. It is a technical form of diplomacy. You aren't just signing a treaty, you are integrating your hardware into their national defense. It is much harder to break a technical integration than it is to tear up a piece of paper.
That is a very cynical but accurate way to look at it. It is building a dependency that is baked into the silicon. But we should also mention the role of these bases in intelligence gathering. It is not just about tracking missiles. These sites are massive vacuum cleaners for electronic intelligence. They are listening to communications, tracking ship movements, and mapping the digital landscape of the entire region. That intelligence is the currency that buys a lot of cooperation from regional partners.
So if I am a listener trying to keep an eye on how this develops, what should I be looking for? Is it the number of troops, or is there a better metric?
Watch the foreign military sales data. That is the real indicator. Look for when the United States approves the sale of advanced radar upgrades or missile interceptors to the Gulf states. That tells you how the network is expanding. Also, look for mentions of base realignment and closure style movements within the theater. If the United States starts moving assets from the coast of the Gulf to the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, that is a clear sign they are preparing for a sustained conflict where the coastal hubs are considered too vulnerable.
That is a great tip. It is about following the hardware, not the headlines. The headlines will tell you about the political posturing, but the hardware tells you the actual strategy. We have covered a lot of ground here, from the ANT-PY2 radars to the warm depots and the sovereignty paradox. It is a much more complex picture than just soldiers in the desert.
It is a high-stakes chess match played with billion-dollar sensors and decades of logistical planning. And as we see in 2026, the preparation that went into these forward depots over the last few years is being tested every single day. The fact that we haven't seen a full-scale regional war yet is, in many ways, a testament to how effective this invisible architecture has been at complicating Iran's offensive plans.
It is the ultimate deterrent. If it works, nothing happens, and people wonder why we spend so much money on it. But if it fails, the consequences are catastrophic. It is a thankless job in that sense. I think it is also worth noting how this ties back to our previous discussions on the air bridge. Without that constant logistical heartbeat, these bases would just be isolated islands. The air bridge is what makes the network a living thing.
And it is a very expensive living thing. The fuel costs alone for the constant C-17 rotations are staggering. But when you compare it to the cost of a full-scale war or the disruption of global energy markets if the Strait of Hormuz were to be closed, it starts to look like a bargain. That is the cold, hard logic of the forward depot model. You spend billions on the insurance policy so you don't lose trillions in a conflict.
Well, I think we've given Daniel a pretty thorough breakdown of why those bases are there and how they are functioning in the current crisis. It is a fascinating mix of old-school logistics and cutting-edge sensor technology. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one last thing. You mentioned that these bases are becoming software-defined. Does that mean they are also vulnerable to cyber attacks in a way that traditional bases weren't?
That is the new front line. If you can't blow up the radar with a missile, you try to blind it with code. The United States is pouring an incredible amount of resources into the cyber defense of these IAMD networks. Every node in that hub and spoke system is a potential entry point. So while we talk about hardening with concrete and steel, the digital hardening is just as critical. We have seen several instances where Iranian-linked groups have tried to penetrate the logistical networks that manage those war reserve stocks. If you can mess up the inventory system, the depot becomes useless because nobody knows where the parts are when they need them.
It is like a digital version of the sovereignty paradox. You are more capable because you are connected, but you are more vulnerable because you are connected. It is the trade-off of the modern age.
It really is. But for now, the shield is holding. The combination of high-end sensors, pre-positioned supplies, and a highly flexible air bridge has created a defensive posture that is incredibly difficult to crack. It is not a static wall, it is a dynamic, resilient net.
I think that is a perfect place to leave it. The image of a digital net stretched across the desert, watching and waiting. It is both impressive and a little bit haunting when you think about the stakes involved.
It is the reality of 2026. We live in a world where peace is often maintained by the silent hum of a radar array and the constant rotation of transport planes.
Well, this has been a deep dive. I definitely have a better understanding of why these places look the way they do now. It is a far cry from the green zones and desert camps of the past.
It is a whole new era of theater-level strategy, and we will be here to keep tracking how it evolves.
We certainly will. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. It is the tech behind the scenes that makes this whole collaboration possible.
If you found this technical breakdown useful, we have a massive archive of over 1,300 episodes at myweirdprompts.com. You can search for topics like missile defense, regional logistics, or any of the previous episodes we mentioned today.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts there. And if you have a second to leave a review on your favorite podcast app, it really does help more people find these deep dives.
It makes a huge difference. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from slow